Hey everyone, James from the Flying Guillotine here, bringing you another film review. Today I'm going to be talking about the first Italian title that I've talked about. I've already talked about a couple of giallis, definitely one of my favorite genres, one of my favorite Italian subgenres for that matter, with a Italian title, the famous or infamous film, Strip Nude for Your Killer, 1975. All right, let's go. So immediately, the title is just extremely evocative of the sort of films that of what it's trying to do. This film is probably most known for just really being a very, very sleazy giallo. It has a reputation not totally unlike the New York Ripper. Those two are probably the two most famous, very, very sleazy giallos. I personally think both are quite good. Personally, I'd rank New York Ripper above this. I think it has a little bit more interesting setting and subtext to it. And that's a film that really, really grows in my sort of esteem the more I think about it and the more I've seen it. This film I've always liked, and I still do like it. It comes at a really interesting part of giallos. New York Ripper comes in the 80s, so it's much, much later. But Strip Nude for Your Killer is 1975. Which is definitely a few years after the giallo's heyday, but not way after. Some of the most famous gialli came out in 1975, notably Deep Red, which I would probably put at 1A or 1B as far as my personal giallo rankings, with Tenebrae. Definitely one of the ultimate films in the genre, and absolutely essential for anyone interested in Italian genre films. Depending on the day, might be my favorite Dario Argento film. So Giallo at this point is way past Bird with the Crystal Plumage and sort of the golden era that brought in. And so it's sort of in the process of dying. And so you'll see a lot of directors just trying to figure out different ways to just take that really familiar Giallo dish and just spice it up and flavor it in different manners and just keep it interesting. One way that they do that is they sort of have these genre mixes. For instance, something like the Poliziotteschi, which was famous right around this era, slightly after the Giallo's heyday. And they will have sort of like this Poliziotteschi elements and combine it with Giallos. Probably most notably something like Suspicious Death of a Minor from Sergio Martino, or What Have They Done to Your Daughters from Massimo Dallamano. Another one is Calling All Police Cars by Mario Caiano. And so those films are all 1974 and 1975. So right in the same era when they're really, really pushing the limits towards like mixing genres and being just a little bit more experimental with sort of the structure of the form. I think this film, well, it might have minor Poliziotteschi influences, is really not one of those Giallo Poliziotteschi combinations. But I do think it combines another genre that is maybe a little less heralded with the Giallo for some pretty interesting results, and I don't think that's often mentioned. Most obviously, the thing that this does is it really amps up the nudity and the sleaze factor of the film, and in a way that maybe these earlier giallos like Bird with the Crystal Plumage, Cat o' Nine Tails were not doing so. Not that those films weren't particularly sexy or having appeal, they just don't push it quite as far as this. So I think that's one way in which it pushes. For me personally, I do like sleaze some of the time, but a lot of it depends on sort of the quality of the film. There's oftentimes it's if you have sleaze but it's a poorly made film, it's not going to resonate with me in the same way. Something like the Poliziotteschi push stuff in the same ways, or even the spaghetti westerns, and not all those films I think are great. Probably some notable not so great ones for Giallo. Giallo in Venice, most notably, at the end of the 70s, is a really, really sleazy Giallo that's not particularly great. And there's a few others too. But for me, I'm not put off by the sleaze like some others might. So if you're someone that really is not turned off by sort of the idea of a really, really sleazy Giallo that's already pushing the limits of a genre that can be sleazy to start with, then maybe this film is not necessarily for you. Okay, well, I'm going to pull back just a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of that genre mishmash. So one thing I was listening to is the Fragments of Fear podcast on this film, which is a great podcast and a great podcast episode. I definitely recommend you check that out. I would love if they would do some more episodes. That's Peter and Rachel Nisbet. Is they talked about the Italian sex comedy. And that's not a genre that is often ever talked about. And if you're looking at the casting of this, you would look at someone like Edwidge Fenech, who is perhaps the most recognizable name or actor or performer in Giallo period, and be like, okay, of course they cast her because she was in all of these classic Sergio Martino films, genre classics of the time, Strange Adventures of Mrs. Ward, All the Colors of the Dark, blah, 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 blah. But she was actually just as well known for her Italian sex comedies at the time, too. Films that really did also push the limits of nudity and those sorts of things as well. So having her in here does not necessarily mean she was cast just for her Giallo bona fides. She was also very well known for sort of those Italian sex comedies. Similarly, you could look at the director, Andrea Bianchi, who is most famous, outside of Italy especially, for something like Burial Ground. Not a film I particularly care for, but it has a bit of a cult following for being just very extreme and sleazy as well, in sort of the Italian gore zombie subgenre. And another film, Cry of the Prostitute, done the year before this, 1974, that sort of pushes the polizioteschi into similarly very crass, sleazy vibes there too. So he's a director that really pushed in those senses. So you can say, okay, they wanted Bianchi to direct this because he is really good at pushing limits and stuff like that. And yes, that is probably true to some extent. But the film he directed in between Cry of the Prostitute and Strip Nude for Your Killer was actually an Italian sex comedy as well. So I think some of those elements of nudity especially are not just necessarily the sleaze factor, although that's certainly some of it, but it's also perhaps some of the sex comedy aspect pushing into this genre. So I found that comment to be very interesting in Fragments of Fear. So want to give them credit for sure. And it's something where once you think about it, it's hard to unsee that. I think this is a film that if you see it, some of its more lewd elements are so upfront and in your face that you will miss a lot of stuff that's actually quite interesting and good, and influences that are not necessarily as over the top as some of like the nudity and stuff would make you think. So I think similar to New York Ripper, this is a film that you can appreciate different aspects of it once you sort of see it that first time and get over that shock and awe that you're going to experience from it. New York Ripper, especially on rewatches, has really impressed me with a lot of like the subtext and interesting things that it's going to say. I'm not going to say that Strip Nude for Killer is necessarily on that level and doing those same things, but I do think it is also just a well-made, interesting film, period. If we think about the things that really appeal to, or at least I think about the things that appeal to me about Giallo, something like the 1970s aesthetic, the cinematography, and just the way that they film stuff. The Italian film industry had just a ton of really, really great technicians, how these scores often just punch way above their weight, and this film really has all of that. The aesthetics there. I love a lot of the 1970s interiors and stuff like that. The cinematography, I think, is really quite good, and I would say solidly above average. This is a well-made film, and I do like the way it sort of frames and blocks certain things with objects in the foreground, and we're seeing people in the background. Good uses of shadows. This film is very, very dark. I think it's great nighttime photography. Love the outfit of the killer, black gloves. You know, it's not necessarily going to break any records or set any new trends with this stuff, but it is, in my view, quite a well-made film. I think the score is also quite good too. Sometimes it kind of goes in this more romantic, classy direction, areas where you wouldn't necessarily associate the Giallo, and I think that actually works pretty well in this movie. So you look at those core elements of the Giallo that work well for the genre as a whole, and this film does have those. So I think this is sort of like taking that really classic dish and just adding more and more to it, in a way that, might put some people off if you don't like the sleaze, or if the comedy really doesn't work for you, or it might be kind of interesting. For me, I fall into more of that latter camp. I actually really do enjoy this film. Another thing that I think is worth discussing at least is the casting here. Probably the most notable cast I already talked about, Edwidge Fenwick. This is a very different role from her, very different from the role she's most known for, stuff like Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward, All the Colors of the Dark, great films, better than this movie. But she's good in here too, and the role is different. She I think she is a better performer than she is usually given credit to, and I think she's very good in this film. Having her in this movie, and frankly, she's quite underused. I would have loved to see her a little bit more in this film, but it's kind of like having one of the absolute best performers in the genre just come off the bench for you. So like having an all-star in basketball come off the bench, like Manu Ginobili or something, and just like immediately all eyes go to her and just sort of captivate your attention in a way. And the supporting players, a lot of different sort of just classic Italian character actors in here. The lead is played by Nino Castanova, who I actually find to be quite charming in this role. He's definitely playing kind of a sleazy asshole. If you just watch the first scene in the film, you'll just watch him just basically follow this girl around in such a shameless, on-the-nose fashion. Meanwhile, the girl he's supposed to meet up with finds him and is like, what the hell? And ends up watching them just have sex in the sauna afterwards. And it just shows you kind of what sort of film and protagonist you're in for. Personally, I find that quite funny and fun. It's on the nose and can be certainly tasteless at times, but I have a certain charm, at least I am what I am, so I find a certain charm in that sort of stuff too. I think also in terms of just the craftsmanship, it's a well put together Giallo. There's a lot of suspense. It's very patient in a lot of those scenes, and you just have to wait and wait and wait. And for me, I find it very engaging when directors actually try to create and engage with that suspense. Again, these are not necessarily the best kills or the best suspense pieces that the genre has to offer, but I do think they are quite good. So for me, this film is maybe not top 10 or top 20 Giallo, but if we're expanding that list and going to 30 or 40, I would definitely say this Giallo would qualify in terms of that. So I talked a little bit about just how the Italian sex comedy, which was the popular genre at the time, sort of seeps into this. I think this film is quite funny. At least I do find it so. A lot of that is derived from sort of the just crass assholeness of Carlo, who is played by Nino Castanova. But there's also some other scenes that sort of take advantage of this like very leery, seedy side and do it. For instance, one scene I wanted to bring up is the interrogation that we have. And we basically have the head of the studio, the woman head of the studio, talking with one of the detectives, and they're having like a real conversation focused on narrative and plot, and it's sort of accomplishing that. Meanwhile, at the same time, the scene is shot that we have a second detective and a model who from the agency basically, and they are basically discussing the case. Meanwhile, the other two who are not talking the whole time are just sort of eyeing each other, and it's meant to be funny, seedy, leery at the same time. And so I think it kind of succeeds at doing stuff like that. And that scene, is it necessary for the plot to advance? No, not necessarily. You don't necessarily need those other two characters there. But it kind of shows you the different flavors that this film is building. The film also is just constructed on a very familiar premise, probably most notably something like Blood and Black Lace, where you just have a big troop of people, and probably one of them is going to end up being the killer, and they just start getting knocked off one by one. And so it just takes that very familiar premise, which I find to be, a perfectly fine premise, and just adding some different elements to it. And I think it's just enough that this film is quite a standout in the Giallos, and I think of these sort of like mid to late period Giallos, it is definitely one of the better ones too. Another scene, maybe my favorite scene of the film, or at least the scene I find to be the funniest, is where Maurizio basically hijacks Doris in the car and takes her to him and his wife's like second house, where they basically used to have different affairs. And this scene is probably problematic in 17 different ways, but I think it does really show the different power dynamic between the two. And how Doris basically gets coerced into trying to have sex with Maurizio, who can't even perform. And it is quite tasteless and crass in the way it's shown, but I do find it's kind of a very notable scene that we get capped up at the end with like a blow-up doll that Maurizio says is the only thing he can make love to. And there's something a little bit oddly sad about that. Sad and funny at the same time. Maurizio is played by Franco Diogene. Sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing that. Was actually only 27 at the release of this film, who looks much, much older. But I thought that was another scene that was quite interesting. And it transitions right from that into a suspense scene where we have the very overweight Maurizio blowing up a blow-up doll and realizing that the water is running, which is sort of the cue here, sort of like the deep red lullaby that plays when the killer is starting to attack. So, this film just has a ton of those just very familiar Giallo tropes, but for me at least, just enough of that more interesting, different characteristics that it keeps it fresh and it keeps it interesting. I did almost bring this film onto Film to Film podcast, but it just narrowly did not make the cut. I was trying to decide between this and some other sort of like mid to late period Giallos that sort of push the limits in different ways, and I ended up electing to choose something else. So wanted to bring it on here, trying not to cover the same films there. Okay, well, going to give this film a 7.5 rating, and I think the winner of the film is Andrea Bianchi, who is not my favorite director by any means. This is probably my favorite film from him. I'm not a huge fan of Burial Ground or Cry of the Prostitute's fine for what it is. It's not a film that leaves me desiring more. But I would definitely recommend this film for Giallo fans or fans that like their Giallo on the more seedy, sleazier end. So yeah. That concludes this review of Strip Nude for Your Killer. Thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you like this film, if it's one of your favorites or if it's something that is no thank you. I can totally see either way. Yeah, for me, this film's definitely a thumbs up though. So thank you all for tuning in, and cheers.